Today, we're going to be speaking with Douglas Murray, who is the best-selling author of numerous books, including The Madness of Crowds, The Strange Death of Europe. It's great to have you on, first and foremost.
Very good to be with you, David.
So we're having this conversation just a few days before a major election here in the United States, where there will be either another 4 years of Donald Trump or not. There will be either more Republican control of the Senate or not. And really a lot of the next 2, 4, 6 years in the United States depends on the outcome of this election. We've seen in other sort of Western Democratic allies also sort of turning points or potential inflection points in terms of a more nationalist move or not. I guess with you, where I would want to start is, what do you see as the state of conservatism right now? And does that relate in any way to Donald Trump, or is Donald Trump not really part of that movement as some traditional conservatives in the United States feel?
It's a broad and complex question, and it needs a broad and complex answer. I mean, the short answer is I think there has been a slightly uncomfortable alliance in recent years between Donald Trump and the Republican Party and a broader conservative movement in the US. And whether that remains uncomfortable, becomes more uncomfortable, or leads to some terrible bloodletting will, I suppose, depend on whether or not he wins the election, not many days' time. I think that there will be, if he doesn't win the election, I think there will be considerable going over of exactly what it is that happened in the last 4 years and more in American Republican politics that allowed for this to happen. If he does win, of course, that all changes, because everybody migrates towards victors. And many people on the conservative side in American politics, many people who were unsure, for instance, about joining his administration or being aligned with it in the first 4 years, may decide to make some peace with it. Not everybody, but some more people will. I don't think, by the way, that although there is an attempt always by the international media to always draw sort of clear lines, we always like it to be, the world's turning left or the world's turning right. And it never quite works like that, I think. There are trends you can see, but I don't actually think that Donald Trump is part of any broader conservative or right-wing, tendency. He is, whether you're a admirer, detractor, or one of the confused people in the middle, I mean, he is a very unusual force. I don't think he is in any ways replicated in other countries. He's not replicated in my own country, for instance, in the United Kingdom. So it's very hard to draw broader lessons away from Donald Trump.
Yeah, I completely agree with you that when I look at Donald Trump and I look at what were sort of more traditional conservative principles, I don't see anything there. Sometimes by sheer odds, he will stumble across something that sort of seems to fit. And for the most part, I see kind of a buffoonery in a dark room stumbling around and sometimes hitting a light switch. But that sort of gets to maybe a more forward-looking question, which is, I see you as someone who, although I think we would, agree about a few things, sort of, but have significant political disagreements, I see your brand of conservatism as something that is almost directly antithetical to most of what Donald Trump's policy has been. And my curiosity is, do you think that it makes sense for American conservatives to align with Trump and sort of try to use him to the extent they can to accomplish, for example, the confirmation of judges, which really has been a major success for the Republican Party under Trump, because he'll nominate whoever they tell him to nominate? Or is that dangerous for the future of your own movement?
Well, first of all, I'm not a part of a movement. Conservatism is a very tricky beast to lasso, because conservatives conserve different things in different countries. What conservatives are conserving in France is different from what a conservative is conserving in Britain or Belgium or Denmark, let alone the United States or anywhere else. It's not quite the same to that extent with what's become known, I think, erroneously as liberalism or leftism, which tends to have the same set of demands. It's a virtue and a vice of the left. I think conservatism, it's harder to sum up like that as an international trend. You're right, by the way, that Donald Trump is unusual. I don't think it's quite correct to say that he has sort of nothing in common with conservatism in the United States. I mean, certain obvious aspects of his agenda are, very conservative. He advocates borders. Now, I mean, by the way, that didn't used to be, seen as being a particularly right-wing thing, but it has become a conservative aspect to be, broadly against open borders, or more in favour of stricter immigration policies. I'd also
I guess
say
I'm
that
just
in
Douglas.
terms of
I'm just not so sure that that is actually what makes him stand out as conservative, because when I see the Democratic proposals, on DACA, for example, or as we get
yeah,
into details about it, I'm not seeing anybody advocating for open borders, free movement
yeah.
of labor. I just don't see that.
Well, no, what has happened? What has happened is that the left in America and elsewhere has been finding it increasingly hard to react against a specific, I think I agree with you, rather unusual narrative on the left, which nevertheless the left is finding it increasingly hard to resist. I mean, obvious things. People who come to the US illegally, amnesties, these sorts of things. There has become a tendency. I think it's a shame for the immigration debate to be seen in the left-right demands. It didn't used to be, of course. There are people on the left like Bernie Sanders who used to recognize the labor implications more of this sort of thing. But just, I don't want to get stuck on borders for the time being. My point is simply that the president has a stricter policy than his opponents on immigration, rather boasts about it, if anything. He clearly advocates the law and order agenda, defending police rather than any truck with people who say they want to defund them. Look, I think, as I say, Donald Trump is a very difficult person to draw any clear lessons from, because obviously these things that I've just mentioned and many others are central to his platform. They've been central to a lot of conservative voters voting for him, and yet he is a totally unusual beast in nature. And I suppose that one of the sadnesses to me of the last 4 years is been the unwillingness to learn the lessons of what the electorate might have been saying 4 years ago in voting for somebody who so many people had so many problems with, not least on his own side.
If you voted in the United States, would you be voting for Donald Trump's reelection?
One of the great pleasures of not being a citizen of the United States is not having to weigh in any way on the fractional politics. And so as an outsider, I will dodge that question.
So
I
it's
actually
just
don't
not
know.
it's not a question you answer.
It's not a question I answer. I'm not an American, and I don't presume to say how I would vote if I was an American. I wouldn't like to advise any Americans on how they should vote. I can see a lot of arguments each way, but I think unless you live in a country and you pay taxes in a country and experience the life in that country, I think you have to be very wary in saying how people in that country should vote.
That's interesting. I'd love to talk more about that, because, like, for example, I was born in Argentina, but I don't live there. But I'm very comfortable saying if I did, I would not have voted for the current president. Or, in Israel, I would not be a supporter of Benjamin Netanyahu. Or in the UK, I would not be a supporter of Boris Johnson. And, I'm not suggesting to anybody else that I know more than them or telling them how to vote. But why is it that you find it inappropriate to comment on something like that?
We're a few days out from an election. I write on these issues, but I don't like to opine on how people should vote. I just don't do it.
That's interesting.
It's just a principle on it. I primarily think that outsiders in the country shouldn't do that.
And what is the principle that leads you to that conclusion?
Well, I think I just said it. I don't think that if you don't live in the country, don't pay taxes, and much more, that you really should go around advising people in any way how to vote, which obviously saying how you would vote in a country that does that. But I think, the one thing I would say is that obviously it's a very tricky situation that your country, the United States, is in now, and I think that it's a very serious time, not just to do with Donald Trump. I think it's a very serious time in American history, and a difficult corner that you're at.
To the extent that there is a sort of wing of the electorate, and this exists significantly in online circles that cross country lines. You see a sort of coalescing around certain ideas about identity politics and free speech suppression. Sometimes it includes discussions of tech monopolies or social media networks. Sometimes the idea of a culture war is sort of raised. I think you sort of understand the sort of umbrella that I'm referring to. How important do you think that is in relation to what we sometimes consider the sort of major policy debates around things like healthcare? You mentioned immigration, foreign policy. Do they overlap significantly? Are these groups of people that are concerned with very, very different things and aren't as worried about those big policy questions? What's the interaction there?
I mean, all of these things shift, don't they, all the time? Foreign policy, in particular, which you mentioned, is a good example. There are parties that have been very interventionist in the United States and in the United Kingdom in my lifetime, which within years become relatively isolationist. All of these things shift around. No political party remains totally static, albeit they like to give out the impression very often they do. And I think that it's very hard to draw these trends across borders. I think you're right. I think one thing that is happening in all of our countries clearly is that there is this uncomfortable disconnect going on between let's say the traditional political wars which have always gone on and which always will go on, and then these larger, you might even say to some extent deeper sort of identity issues that are going on underneath everybody. These ones are, and some people call these culture wars and much more. These are very tricky things for politics to address because you can do them sort of glibly. You can sort of nod to them. But most politicians find them very dangerous to touch. That's certainly the experience in my own country, the British politics, is that there are these deep issues which occasionally, I think of them like a sort of geyser. I don't mean it in the Cockney Guy Ritchie sense, by the way. I mean, there's a type of geyser thing that happens where a moment allows the jet to come up and suddenly everybody notices it. And you notice what's going on underneath. One of the interesting things that happens with the interaction of politics with what you describe as this sort of online world is that these things occasionally erupt and people can sort of refer to them, but they don't know what to do with them otherwise. I mean, you can have an issue, I don't know, there'll be a specific piece.
Well, I mean, I think cancel culture is an interesting one to think about, where you've had online now for a couple of years. There have been, all of these debates happening about, does one have a right to speak at a college or not? Right. And what does it mean if there are protests? And what about their speech? And then it bled over to where Donald Trump has sent some of his wildly capitalized tweets where he talks about cancel culture. It's sort of pushed slightly above the surface into something Trump is talking about. Is that maybe an example?
Yes, it is. It is. It's not a bad example. I would say, again, it's a good example in some ways because you have that row about that specific thing. For instance, should X person speak at Y venue?
Yes.
But we struggle with this question of, for instance, why are so many people in our time finding it so incredibly hard to hear a contrary opinion? What would the limits of opinion be? Can they be in the public sphere the same thing that they are online? These are all questions that we've been forced to more or less think about and very imperfectly address because of the strange online world which we all live with. I think I say somewhere at the beginning of The Madness of Crowds that the famous quote about technology, that it's always the effects of technology are always overestimated in the short term and underestimated in the long term. The underestimation in the long term of the debate that is going on online is that it clearly is massively affecting political discourse at a wider level, but it's just not clear exactly how political discourse adapts to that. And it's extremely hard to see how politics can actually speak to parts of that in a reasonable way without falling down some well hole waiting for it. Which I think is, by the way, is the fear. But on something like that, why are people finding it so hard, disagreeable to hear opinions that are different from their own. I mean, your country, I'd say your country, the United States, has obviously racked itself not on not being able to hear opinions, but a version of that, which is the number of friendships, family fallouts you hear about to do with how you vote. I mean, Republican Democrat politics, again, we shouldn't be rosy about this. It was never some wildly clean battle that used to go on. But I think it's only in recent years that we've been in this situation, as we have been in a different situation with my own country over Brexit, where family members fall out, where old friends don't speak to each other anymore, where people actually cannot sit down at the dinner table without screaming at each other because of electoral politics. That is something I think that is relatively new, certainly in a sort of peacetime.
Yeah, that
And
may
I think
be, but I
we
think
need to work out what it is that's going on.
yeah, I think so we could talk about the kind of interpersonal dynamics thing. I just don't I've still not seen evidence that it is a big problem that people can't or don't want to hear contrary opinions. I mean, I think this is the problem sometimes. So let me give an analogy. If you spent a lot of time online in the lead up to the Democratic primary, you would have had an impression that so-called socialism and the ideas of Bernie Sanders were far more popular in the Democratic Party than they actually were shown to be by the votes in which Joe Biden quite easily defeated Bernie Sanders. Much the same way, if you spend your time looking at videos of a speaker shouted down somewhere or of somebody banned on Twitter or whatever the case may be, you would have the impression that this is really a widespread problem, when the reality is there are tens of millions of college students who are glad to hear contrary impressions, and speakers are invited without incident, and you don't hear about it because it's unremarkable. That's really the majority based on what these anecdotal instances.
Well, first of all, the instances aren't anecdotal. I mean, and when colleges actually have to announce new policies in relation to speaker policies, it's obvious that they're doing so in reaction to a changing reality. Look, the American college campus example is one I don't particularly like to get into for several reasons. One, it's a highly unusual circumstance that people are in there. And secondly, it has the risk of being totally disconnected from the rest of people's lives. I think that the issue where so-called cancel culture, it's not a term I approve of or like to use.
Yeah.
The so-called cancel culture really is a problem, is people in their workplaces who, their bosses basically dictate that there is a set of things that they can say or think. And if they don't think the right things, they can lose their jobs. And I'm not thinking about sort of highfalutin professors sort of things. I'm thinking of cases like supermarket workers and so on, who can be fired. And we had a recent case in the UK, fired from their job because they liked a Billy Connolly video. Billy Connolly is one of the most successful comedians of his generation. And there is this sense out there, again, it's hard to put your finger on, but it's clearly there, that, there are things that people can say, which if you are not in a protected group, by the way, I include university students to some extent in that as a protected group. They enjoy a lot more protections than you do if you're on a minimum wage salary in a supermarket and you've just liked the wrong thing on Facebook. Then there is a genuine sense that people are thinking, what is going on that we can't, not only that we can't tolerate different opinions, that we haven't learned how to do it, but that there seems to be some set of opinions which is regarded as being monstrous.
But isn't this the problem that in other words, even in presenting it, you've blended together. People aren't allowed to say certain things at work or think. And of course, think now is a very different circumstance than say. And then you've given an example of a like for a supermarket worker in your country getting fired. But that is, I'm not defending it. But what I am saying is it's extraordinarily unlikely. I mean, it almost doesn't happen statically. It does not belittle or dismiss that if it happens, we should look at it and deal with it.
I don't know how you would judge that. I mean, I wouldn't like to say how common or otherwise it is, and I don't think it's possible to say anything to the contrary either. I would say, for instance, can you think? I mean, here's one. Can you think of a time in your own life until now where it's become quite commonplace for a boss to give a reading list to their staff saying what books their staff should read? I had never heard of that until the last year or so.
Listen,
Had
when
you? Had you?
so I think it depends on what types of books you're talking about. When I worked in sales in high school 20 years ago, I got a
Well, it was
list
that in
of books.
America, by the way.
This is in the United States.
Okay.
I got a list of books that would be useful in order to be a better salesperson. And they included everything from Seven Habits of Highly Effective People by the Mormon Stephen Covey to, more academic, all sorts of different things. When I then were, so I don't think that that's particularly rare. I think maybe the problem you have is which books are on the list.
No. I don't have a problem with that at all.
Oh, okay.
First of all, I think the case you give. I assume I'm not familiar with your early history in sales, but let me suggest that I think the books you were probably given would try to make you a better salesperson. It wasn't to construct your character morally. I might be wrong.
I mean, listen, I don't know. You look at How to Win Friends and Influence People and those types of books. I think they overlap certainly with one's demeanor and relationship building. I don't know. But again, the point is, I think we're in the weeds.
What I'm saying is
yeah.
that if I discovered that, if I discovered that there were bosses in America or in Britain who were giving reading lists to their staff and they said, you have to read Douglas Murray's new book or Jordan Peterson's new book, or gave a list of I don't know, people who might be seen as being in a similar space to me, I genuinely wouldn't be thrilled.
I don't disagree with you. I don't disagree with you.
I think there's something sinister about it. I think there's something. It's a form of mini totalitarianism. It's about trying to adapt thoughts of your workers. I think it's reprehensible. And if I discovered that bosses in public or private companies were saying that, I would say no. That's not the purpose of literature. It's not the purpose of books. It's not the purpose of writing. It certainly isn't the job of a boss to tell the workers what to read. Now, here's the thing.
Yeah.
You're right. I have a specific problem with the books that are actually on these lists. Alas, as it were, for the purposes of this argument, we haven't had bosses demanding that their workers have to read me. But I mean, as I say, in any situation, it's ugly. In the situation we're in, we have, as I say, private and public companies where the bosses are writing to their employees telling them, you should read the following texts. And they're always the same ones. They're, for instance, Robin DiAngelo's White Fragility. It's Kendi, it's Edo Lodge, it's all of that. And I think again, relatively few people will lose their jobs because relatively few people will make some terrible scene and say a totally appalling thing and have to be fired over it. What it does is it accentuates this very unpleasant trend in which people feel that there is a right thing to think and a wrong thing to think, a right way to feel and a wrong way to feel. And effectively, the realm of politics where we used to hash out these things gets pushed down to that lower level that I was trying to describe earlier in that culture wars issue. That political engagement, a political argument gets pushed down to some subterranean place because people don't know what they can say. And here's the thing, by the way, I mean, there are lots of downsides to that. I've been in the States for the last month, touring around the country, visiting a lot of different parts of it. And one of the things that I've been very struck by is the fact it is exceptionally hard to know how this election is going to go. You can rely on the polls, and there are all sorts of things can be said about that. But one of the reasons why it's exceptionally hard whenever anyone has said to me, how do you think it's going to go? You can't guess because so many people have suppressed their views. So many people literally just will not tell you. Now, that seems to me, if you're an American voter and an American taxpayer, to be a very strange situation to be in. You might be, I mean, I would have thought by now, for instance, it should be perfectly possible. I regret that this is not the case, to say, look, I think Donald Trump has done a number of things that are good. I don't find him character-wise a particularly ideal figure. I'm going to vote for him anyway. And people would go, oh, well, that's an interesting thing to see. Would you like any more coffee or whatever? and weirdly, you're not in that situation in America. You're in this situation where voters and taxpayers in this country will not tell their spouses, honestly, who they're going to vote for. They won't tell. I've had people literally tell me they will not tell their nearest and dearest how they're going to vote. Now, of course, I've started to work out this must be because they're voting Donald Trump. But But that is a deeply unhealthy situation for democracy to be in.
We are out of time, but I think where we disagree is not whether those individual instances point to something negative in society, which I agree with you that they do. I think our disagreement would be, my view is, in a country of 331 million people with what before this pandemic was 158 million workers, the number of people that have been forced to read Robin DiAngelo's book from the standpoint of it rising to being a major political issue right now, I believe is almost zero. The number of people hiding from their spouse who they're voting for is statistically insignificant in thinking about the challenges this country faces. That's where I think we disagree.
Oh, if I can say so, I don't think, first of all, I don't think either things you just said are the case, but I don't think either are statistically negligible. But no, my point is, it's a much broader point. I'm glad you allowed me to end on this. The point is that if you're not allowed to, if you can't even as a culture discuss on those levels, if you can't even talk about who you're going to vote for, feel comfortable to voice disagreements and have them out, then you can't address any of those other levels. Do you honestly think this country is going to have a sensible immigration, taxation, or any other policy if you can't have the most basic discussions? If you can't have the most basic discussions, you're never going to have the nuanced ones. That's why it's a problem, and that's why you should be worried.
I think that the vast majority of people are able to have those discussions. And the reason that when people are not able to have them, they're unable to have them, is that a lot of people don't even acknowledge the fundamental facts that must serve as the starting point for those discussions, which is an altogether different problem than the one that you're pointing out.
Well, it may be. It depends exactly what you're referring to, obviously. I would simply say that it's my experience traveling around this country in recent weeks that it's at a very difficult ebb and that it's not for very straightforward reasons. I don't think it's for any straightforward left-wing reasons or right-wing reasons. But you have cities in this country where, among other things, you have totally wrecked public squares, you have decimated economies, you have boarded up business after boarded up business. You have, we saw last night in Philadelphia, looting. I can assure you the situation, in terms of law and order that's occurred in this country now, is highly unusual in a first world society. I've traveled far enough in the world to be able to say that.
That I agree with.
That alone should be something which should alarm people and should make them realize that none of these issues are ephemeral. None of them are Ivy Tower. None of them relate only to the imbibing of small books. They all have to do with a culture which has become incredibly poor at having serious disagreements out seriously and being able to reconcile them. And it isn't because one group of people is appalling by nature or anything like it. It isn't because one group of people has possession of everything that is right and good. It's that you have the mechanisms in this country how to solve serious problems have broken down, and you see the effects in the cities. And it's too easy to blame that on left and right. And it's too easy to blame it on specific candidates. It's city after city in this country and state after state. And if people felt the shame they should feel about that, they should take some of it on their own shoulders and not just blame their ideological opponents.
Yeah, I do agree that the symptoms that you see as alarming are extremely alarming. Although I am sure that we disagree as to the causes, but that will have to be a conversation for another time. We've been speaking with Douglas Murray, author of The Madness of Crowds, The Strange Death of Europe as well. Douglas, I really appreciate your time, and I think we have plenty to discuss in the future.
We will do. All the best.